I'm really excited to introduce Erin Blay. Erin is a transportation planner with over 14 years of experience, making it easier for people to get where they need to go. She's worked with cities, towns, indigenous communities, and regional agencies to improve transit service, support rural and inter-community travel, and design infrastructure that works for everyone. Alongside her transit work, Erin champions cycling and other active transportation options as part of a more connected, inclusive, and sustainable transportation system. A registered professional planner and member of the Canadian Institute of Planners, Erin is passionate about creating practical, people-first solutions that support mobility, equity, and resilience in communities of all sizes. As a transit planner and lifelong fair weather cyclist, she's going to explore how cycling has shaped her personal journey and deepened her belief that no one is one mode. No one is one mode. And that resilient cities are built through intentional choices that center human movement and the lived experience. Welcome, Erin.
Awesome. Thank you for that warm welcome. And I guess I'm your emissary from the bus and train world for today. My name is Erin Blay. And in the next couple of minutes, I just want to tell you a little story about how my relationship with cycling has changed over the course of my life and how it has kind of informed how I move through the world, I guess, as a transportation professional. And I guess really how it's helped me understand that if we can build a system right, we can make transportation more equitable and accessible for everybody. But first, let's talk about bikes. So when I was asked to speak here today, I started reflecting on what my first memory of cycling was. And I'll be honest with you, it wasn't me cycling. I was the deadbeat, similar to this child here. I was on one of those little child seats, strapped behind my dad, and I was flying down this hill, and it felt like the biggest, best roller coaster. Probably it was a tiny hill. Probably I was shrieking and traumatizing my father. I probably wasn't wearing a helmet because it was the 80s. But all I remember is the wind was in my face, and I was like, my heart was beating in my chest, and it was just the best feeling ever. I'm sure a lot of people here can relate. It was my first taste of how amazing and free transportation could be. And I don't have a picture of this because it was the 80s. I'm dating myself, but that joy in that child's face, that's how I felt, right? As a teenager growing up in Toronto, my bike became my independence. It got me to school, it got me to my friend's place, it got me a part-time job, it got me to the party I definitely wasn't supposed to be at. It was faster than walking, it was cheaper than the TTC, and it was so much better than waiting in the rain for a bus or a streetcar. It was also point of interest when I told my parents I was riding my bike somewhere. They were less concerned about me walking through some of the neighborhoods that might have been a little bit less desirable for a 14-year-old girl to be doing. So you know what? It was just how I got around. It wasn't my identity. I wasn't a cyclist. It was just, how I got from A to B. Looking back though, I think I realized through this I was learning something really important. If you remember being a teenager, you don't really have a lot of control over your life, but by cycling I could sort of own my trip. I could get where I wanted to go on my own terms. I could go at my own speed and on my own schedule. It wasn't depending on my parents. I wasn't depending on the TTC. It was something that I owned. So in grade 11, when I got a job at the E-Maker in downtown Toronto, the Disney store, distinctly not the happiest place on earth, I will have you know, and endless loops of like princess tea parties. Like, oh my god, it was horrifying. But I started making what I now know to be multimodal trips. I would take my I would take my bike to the subway, hop on the train, and head downtown, and it was seamless. It was so seamless I didn't have to think about it. I took it for granted, and I realized I took it for granted when the next year I got a job at the Krispy Kreme factory, which was in the butt end of an industrial park, where the closest bus stop was about 950 meters that I knew very well because there were no sidewalks, the street lighting was poor, and there were certainly no cycling facilities. And I actually wound up quitting that job after one too many near misses, getting sword spiked, walking home after a of integration between those AT modes. I didn't have the words for it then, but what I felt was I was being excluded from this economic opportunity because I didn't have a car and the city didn't provide facilities for me to safely move through space. Okay, fast forwarding just a little bit. As any self-respecting early 2000s young adult, I played a lot of SimCity. Anyone else here? Yes? Thank you. Okay, so SimCity, I got it in my head that this was obviously my calling. I was going to move people around cities. This was my job. I was going to be excellent at it, with the hubris of an 18-year-old. So I lived at the University of Waterloo. That's, I think, 3 of us now. 4 of us Waterloo people. In the co-op program for planning. And so during my time studying planning at Waterloo, I was still the transit nerd that I am today. I did the bulk of my co-op terms at transit agencies, but I also did a co-op term, the region of Waterloo, in transportation demand management. And one of my tasks was helping residents plan their commutes in areas where there was either new AT infrastructure or a new bus route. So, now remember folks, this is like, early 2000s. We didn't have real time in Google. We didn't have the transit app. I was out there with like paper maps and schedules and like hopes and dreams. I was doing my best, showing residents a new way of getting around, right? And it was so interesting coming off of working in a transit agency for a few co-op terms because the things people were saying were like these little things, but they mattered in a really big way. They would say, I would love to take the bus, but I can't walk there. I have to walk on the side of the road. I have my 8-year-old. I don't feel safe doing that. Or I would love to take my bike to the station, but I can't park it safely. I'm worried it's going to get stolen. And to me, these little things, they weren't little things to a lot of people, right? They were gaps in the network that were preventing people from making these multimodal trips. So I think it made me reflect that as a co-op student, when I worked in transit, I didn't think about how people got to the stops. I kind of was like, well, we don't go there, maybe they just materialize like in SimCity, I don't know. But that was kind of the extent to which we had been involved in the trip of getting people that first mile, last mile, right? So I learned kind of through this that if we want people to take transit, we need to think past the bus stop and think about how people are getting there safely, be they walking or be they wheeling. And it gave me a much deeper appreciation of how flexible and empowering your options become when you start stringing these modes together. Okay, fast forwarding again. Clearly I'm like a hand talker, sorry if I'm not speaking into the mic. I get very enthusiastic about this. But fast forward again into adulthood and the pandemic. I'll admit that for a few years before the pandemic, my bike was neglected. Cycling hadn't been a big part of my life for a few years. I'd been living in Halifax, commuting by bus or by ferry. If you haven't been, highly recommend it. It's the best $2.50 you spend in Halifax on that little boat. But all that to say, my poor bike has gathering dust in the basement. But then came COVID-19. I was working from home, I was parenting 2 young children, I was really great. Like many of us, I was sort of struggling with that mental load of lockdown. Everything felt really heavy and uncertain. And so I kind of found myself turning to my bike again. Long solo rides through the trails up through the parks in Shubenacadie, which is in Dartmouth. And it kind of became like a bit like therapy. And when things opened up a bit, cycling became a way that we could safely reconnect with our friends because we were outside, we could social distance. And these rides are kind of how I coped and how I cleared my head and how I kind of remembered who I was outside of Zoom calls and feeding my kids endless snacks so that they would stop yelling at each other. But yeah, the bike just wasn't transportation anymore. It was something that was bright and joyful. And it reminded me that transportation could and should be that as well. So these are 2 of the little people that I do this work for. These are my kids, Sam and Henry. And equity in transportation, I think, reminds us that we need to remember that the freedom of movement isn't something that's distributed equally. And not everyone has the same access to a car or the same ability to walk or the same comfort level on a bike. So for us to be truly inclusive and meet the needs of our residents, we have to design for everyone, the parent with the stroller, the senior with the walker, and everyone in between. As transit planners in particular, I like to think that, of course, it informs how we design our transit networks, but it also asks us to extend our responsibility beyond the bus stop itself to ensure that passengers can actually safely and comfortably access the service that we provide. So now as a mother of two and someone who is approaching mid-career and middle age, thank you for the reminders of that. I ride my bike for joy again, and I see the joy that I felt as a young kid on the faces of my children who benefit hugely from the enormous investments we've made in AT infrastructure here in the city. And I hope that they continue to find joy moving this way. Last slide, I know I'm at time, I'm sorry. So I guess kind of my takeaway here is multimodality isn't just about the infrastructure, it's about building resilience, both in our cities, but in our transportation networks most importantly, and giving people real choices. So I think designing cities that reflect the complexity of how we actually live is really important. And when we center human movement and the human experience, we can develop transportation networks that are equitable, accessible, and multimodal. Thank you.